Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast, hosted by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. After nearly 20 years exploring the world of conspiracy culture, we are taking our guests and listeners on a guided tour of the rabbit hole. Our mission? To discover where the truth lies. Hello and welcome to Some Dare Call It Conspiracy, the podcast that aims to deconstruct and demystify popular conspiracy theories, only to discover where the truth lies. I am Brent Lee, aka the #1 disinformation artist and narrative defender. And of course, I am joined by my favorite turncoat and walking calamity, the brilliant Neil Sanders. How you doing, buddy?
I'm all right, and I'm thankfully injury-free at the moment.
Wicked. Now, before we introduce our guest, just a quick few announcements. We have a new website, and not that Linktree thing, but a proper one. Go check it out at somedarecallitconspiracy.com. You can listen to all the episodes there, and even read Neil's monologue episodes, like the new one about Lawrence Fox and Calvin Robinson's dreadful new podcast. Next, I have finally launched a campaign to raise funds for the very ambitious Tinfoil Confessions project. It's a narrative podcast and book, which is going to give friends and family the tool to pull their loved ones out of the rabbit hole. Your support is vital in bringing this project to life, so please go to www.tinfoilconfessions.com for more details of what this project entails, how to donate, and how your contributions will be spent. And finally, I've been invited to speak at the London Fortean Society on June 22nd with James Ball, Professor Chris French, Professor Karen Douglas, and John Elledge. You can get tickets for the live event or live stream on our website at somedarecallitconspiracy.com/events. Please come along. I would love to meet you guys. Now, on to our guest. And today we are joined by Rupert Read. Rupert is the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He was a co-founder and former spokesman of Extinction Rebellion, and now the director of the Climate Majority Project. Rupert, thank you kindly for joining us. How are you today?
Well, Brent, I'm okay. I'm a very busy man, so I'm on the tired side. But you know, there's a lot to be done in this world, isn't there? So that's why I am really delighted to be with you here on this podcast. I think the work you're doing is so important.
Oh, thank you.
So, Rupert, what first got you interested in climate change?
Gosh, well, I suppose it goes back to my childhood as someone who was in love with nature and then started to realize that nature and indeed human beings were under threat from human beings. And quite a long time ago, it became clear to me that dangerous human-caused climate change was probably the #1 threat to us and nature. And that's when I started to get serious about it, joined the Green Party, started to do philosophical work on it, and I suppose I've never looked back.
Excellent. So, you speak a lot about the precautionary principle. Can you just explain what that is and how that actually applies to climate change theory?
Yeah, so one way to think about this is in terms of arguments that can be deployed in relation to climate change deniers. Now, climate change deniers nowadays are absolutely risible. They only function as conspiracy theorists because the facts are absolutely plain, both in the science and in the actual weather that we're increasingly experiencing. But for anyone who is still in that benighted condition, there is a very useful argument that can be applied to them, which is to say, look, you don't even have to believe the science or trust the models. It just stands to reason that pumping more and more carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, which have not been there in such quantities for a long time, is not a very smart thing to do. It's a reckless thing to do. It's an unprecautious thing to do. The precautionary principle says you don't actually need categorical proof that something is bad to move against it. So another recent example would be these neonicotinoid pesticides that our farmers in this country are using. The EU decided some years ago to ban them until it could be proved that they were safe. because the reasoning goes, if you leave it until you've proved that they are safe before you ban them, then you may be leaving it too late. And indeed, what happened over those subsequent years is that a lot less bees started dying when the pesticides were not being used. And then indeed it was proven that they were very harmful to bees. But the precautionary principle enables one to move ahead of the scientific proof. And that's crucial when the stakes are very high. Unfortunately, we in this country are extremely poor at practicing the precautionary principle, whether on climate or on pesticides. So our government keeps on allowing farmers to use these pesticides, even though they've now been proven to be damaging. But the point in principle is that the precautionary principle is there to help us move ahead of that kind of proof. And it's crucial where the stakes, as I say, are very high.
You were speaking earlier about the sort of, you said the benighted position. You famously refused to debate a climate change denialist on the BBC, which actually altered the way that the BBC reports on climate change. Who was the actual climate change denier?
Oh gosh, now you're asking. I can't remember. This was 6 years ago, and it wasn't anyone very famous. It was just one of these, slightly numpty-ish conspiracy theorists, climate change deniers. The BBC asked me to go on to debate him, as I'd done various times before. But this time, something rose up in me, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And I just found myself saying, no, I won't do it, because this is the wrong debate to be having. It's absurd to be talking about this any more than it would make sense to talk about whether the earth is flat and so on. So they said, oh, all right then. Well, we'll try and find someone else. I sent out a tweet saying what I'd done, and saying that I'd refused to debate them. And a few people wrote back and said, oh, no, you should always debate them. All publicity is good publicity or something. But then other people started chiming in and saying, you did the right thing. That's what we need to do. The next morning, it had 10,000 retweets. It ended up with 40,000 retweets and made headline news in various countries around the world. And it initiated a process whereby the BBC several months later changed their, by this point, absurd policy of using climate change deniers as balance for people like me or scientists and so forth. And so it's probably one of the most consequential things I've ever done. It just goes to show that sometimes doing the right thing and the thing which is a bit uncomfortable is also doing the thing which can get you the most publicity and actually succeed in creating the most change.
Absolutely. So just to explain, what happened was that the BBC would previously have somebody who was a climate change denier on to give the impression that basically there was sort of balance. But you felt that this legitimized that argument.
Yeah, famously, Lord Lawson of the Global Warming Policy Foundation kept being profiled and featured on the BBC. And it was just completely ridiculous to treat him as much of an authority as my former colleagues at the University of East Anglia in climate science, who actually know what they're talking about. So yes, it was long overdue, this change, but we managed to get it at least. And well, there's more things like that need to happen now. For example, the BBC and other broadcasters should be much more skeptical than they are towards the fossil fuel companies, who, of course, as we know, have been long funders of disinformation and are therefore not to be trusted, frankly, on this. Surprise, surprise.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You also famously won't speak to Murdoch own papers because they don't take climate change seriously. Is that anything to do with their funders and their sort of backers, their connection to the oil industry?
Well, actually, I have now started talking to Murdoch owned papers and broadcasters again with some reluctance, but there has been some, it's not enough, but there has been some shift in the editorial policy of Murdoch owned papers, especially in this country. The Sun, for example, is a lot less bad than it was. It doesn't tend to engage anymore in full-on climate change denial. So yeah, for 3 years, I boycotted and wouldn't speak to Murdoch-owned papers. My policy basically is that I will talk to anyone who isn't an out-and-out climate change denier. Or put it another way, I'll talk to anyone and debate them, so long as what we're debating is not an insane conspiracy theory. So for years, I wouldn't talk to Nigel Farage, but now I do talk to him because he's no longer a full-on climate change denier. And it's interesting. It is actually possible to have a semi-intelligent conversation with him now, which is quite encouraging. And I think it's worth doing if one can get the better of the likes of him or Rees-Mogg in debate or Claire Vox, which I like to think I've managed to do on telly and so forth in the last year or two.
Yeah, I think from watching the interviews that you've done with Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think one of the most interesting things that you were able to do with that was they were trying to politicize the issue, and you were trying to take it away from politics and say, no, this isn't about politics, this is about common sense. I think that really helped change how they were like approaching you.
Thanks, Brent. Yeah, you've picked up a really key point there, which is part of the DNA of the Climate Majority Project. Part of our hope is that we can depolarize these debates, which, as you guys will know very well, have become horribly polarized. And we don't see a real way forward on questions such as climate unless we manage to depolarize them to some significant extent. So when I'm debating now with the likes of Farage or Rees-Mogg, I'm very tough on them, but I'm also very civil. And yes, I make clear that I'm not coming at it from an ideological or political point of view. These issues are, to a large extent, issues of science and precaution and ethics and common sense. And actually, the vast majority of people should be able to broadly find themselves on the same kind of playing field when it comes to questions of science and ethics and precaution and common sense.
What do you think about the sort of recent rise in the anti-science movement? Like, you must have been sat there during COVID and stuff like that, just head in hand, I assume.
Well, yeah, it's a shame, isn't it? So let's cast our minds back to 2020. So in early 2020, along with colleagues of mine, such as Nassim Taleb, I was calling upon the government in this country and indeed other governments to move much faster to take precautions against COVID, because it was clear that this could be a profoundly deadly pandemic. I was immensely critical of the British government, and in fact, most British political parties and politicians, for being way too slow to move on COVID. We should have moved faster, and that's why I did the book looking back on this called Timeline of the Plague Year, which is about the grossly inadequate UK response to COVID. So it's profoundly ironic that a year or so later, we start moving into a position where there were other people saying, oh, no, it's not that we didn't move fast enough. We moved too fast and too strongly. It's the exact antithesis of the truth. Now, when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying there's no problems at all with the vaccine or whatever, right? I'm not necessarily kind of giving some kind of crude agenda which kind of whitewashes the pharmaceutical companies or that says that the scientists got everything right, or let alone, even the politicians who are trying to do things right. But what I am saying is that the fundamental attitude we should have approached COVID with is one of precaution. We didn't do that enough. Countries that did do it enough came off miles better than us. Countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, and in fact, some African countries as well. And it is quite dispiriting that COVID has seen a rise in anti-scientism, which has got a wider platform now. And one of the reasons I was so keen to talk to you guys is that I have friends, including one very close friend, who has been sucked into this, what do you call it, abyss of nonsense, this kind of spiral of disinformation through things like YouTube algorithms. A very sensible, very intelligent guy who, from being very precautious like me in the early days of COVID, became a pretty extreme COVID skeptic, and that is dispiriting. In order to combat it, we need to double down on truthfulness. We need to double down on science, but those things are not enough. We also need to make clear the role of precaution. We also need to find ways of reaching out to people. This is the importance of things like Caroline Lucas's endeavor over Brexit, Dear Leavers. This is the importance of organizations like More in Common, who we in the Climate Majority Project work with. And this again is why I seek to be civil, even to those I deeply disagree with. Although there are limits, I won't engage in a debate with somebody who says, oh, COVID doesn't exist, or this is all a conspiracy by world governments to kill loads of us through the vaccine. That's the wrong conversation to be having.
leave that conversation for us.
Yeah, we'll do that one. Yeah, there are certain theories around the government response to COVID. There is a theory that basically they decided to go for herd immunity or something along those lines because essentially it was less disruptive to the infrastructure. And there's even further theories that basically they did this at the request of oil industry in America and certain newspapers in the UK because essentially they didn't want their bottom line to be affected. Have you heard of these theories and what's your take on them?
Well, so I think we need to be subtle in our analysis here. On the one hand, I think it is pretty clear that the government in general and Boris Johnson in particular were very tempted by the so-called herd immunity approach. The Johnson government was extremely reckless in not seeking to close our borders against COVID. Deeply ironic given their general anti-immigration platform. The one time when we needed them to be tough with our borders, they weren't. The Johnson is on record on more than one occasion, and this has been clearly documented. You can find it in my book, Timeline of the Plague Year, saying things which made clear that he wanted Britain to remain apart from the precautious moves that other countries were starting to make on COVID, because he thought it would give Britain an economic advantage. On the other hand, we should also be clear that this was unbelievably stupid thinking, as well as kind of cruel and callous and reckless thinking. It was unbelievably stupid because we saw what happened in countries where they started to have their hospitals overwhelmed by COVID, such as Italy, and it was awful. And it meant that the disruption got even worse. Whereas if you looked at countries that had more intelligent policies, such as South Korea basically managed for a very long time to avoid having any lockdown whatsoever. So did New Zealand. It was possible if one took a kind of really strong attitude towards COVID, which was perfectly accepted by most populations for a long time. It was possible to keep the casualties a lot lower. That doesn't mean you had to do it in the kind of extreme authoritarian way that China did. No, you could do it in the, as I say, intelligent, thoughtful, broadly democratic way that countries like Taiwan and South Korea and New Zealand did. Can I tell you a tiny story about New Zealand?
Yeah, go for it.
So I had a conversation in 2020 with the chief epidemiologist of New Zealand. And he said to me, so in February 2020, we're a small country, New Zealand. In February 2020, we were looking to the big Anglo countries, which traditionally we'd looked to in the kind of crises for leadership. We looked to America. We looked to the UK. We looked to some extent to Australia, but especially to America and the UK. What was the way through this crisis? And then we realized there wasn't going to be any leadership from. So then we started to open up instead to what the countries on the Asian fringe were doing, who of course had experience before with SARS, countries like South Korea and Taiwan. And we learned from them instead. And that's how we managed to have far lower casualties from COVID than the English-speaking countries did. So the great irony of the reckless policies on COVID and of the dallying with conspiracy theorizing that you had in the Conservative Party at times, the great irony of it is not only was it really unintelligent from the beginning, it didn't even make sense on its own terms. Right? The attempt to let COVID move through the population, as Johnson described it at one point, if that had been allowed to run, that would have been far more economically damaging than what actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100%, 100%. So let's just get into it. So what is climate change? Why is it a problem? And what causes it?
All right. So yeah, let's go back to 101. So it's called the greenhouse effect for the following reason. If you've ever been inside a greenhouse on a warm day, or it's the same in a car or whatever, it's a lot warmer than it is outside. Why? Because the heat gets in, but it can't get out again. And basically, that's metaphorically true of our atmosphere. When we put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so gases like carbon dioxide, but also other gases such as methane, we're kind of thickening the atmosphere. It's as if we're putting up something like a sort of faux glass container around the atmosphere as a whole. and heat is getting in, but it's not getting out again. There's a stat which helps people to understand just how extremely strong the greenhouse effect is. So we all know that if you burn oil, petrol, coal, gas, you produce a lot of heat, right? These are very powerful fuels. But here's the thing. If you measure the amount of heat that is produced by burning, say, a liter of petrol, and you compare that to the amount of heat that is kept in the atmosphere by the carbon dioxide which is released by burning that liter of petrol, 60,000 times more heat gets stuck in the atmosphere from that enhanced greenhouse effect compared to the heat that you get from just burning the liter of petrol in the first place. 60,000 times as much. The greenhouse effect is incredibly strong. That's why we're in such trouble, and we are in serious trouble. We've all started to see it now, right? With the destabilization of weather, but also with the general overheating that's slowly going on. So, for example, the insane record-breaking temperatures that we had in the UK in 2022, that 40-degree summer, smashing previous records. Now, as yet, dangerous climate change has not killed many people in countries like this one. It's killed quite a lot of people already in parts of the global south. But in countries like this one, it hasn't killed many people. So for that reason, some people say, well, it's not really that bad, is it? But this is just the beginning. As long as we keep on pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it goes on getting worse forever. The temperatures go up, the climate gets less stable forever until we get to the point of actually stopping doing it. And also, of course, we need to draw some down. So we need to do things like plant more trees and make sure that the trees don't burn. Until we get to that point, those temperatures just keep on going up and going up. So if you care about your grandchildren or your children, or even if you care about yourself and you're not just about to drop dead, it makes total sense to be deeply concerned about the climate. And that's why people who understand this are deeply concerned. So, I've worked most of my adult life alongside some of the greatest climate scientists and ecologists in the world at the University of East Anglia. And they are scared. It's not anymore that they're like, oh, we've got to give you some warnings. Oh, it could become quite bad. But they're actually scared. If you get to talk to them in private, you get to have a drink with them or whatever, as I sometimes do, they'll tell you they are worried about their old age. They'll tell you that they're really kind of down about the prospects of their children. We haven't taken nearly enough action on this yet. We need to take far, far more. That's what the Climate Majority Project exists to do. It is possible this will happen. It is starting to happen. People are starting to move on this. People are starting to wake up. But that process needs to be accelerated. And those who stand in the way of it, which include so-called climate change skeptics, i.e. deniers, conspiracy theorists, etc., and also just climate change delayers, people like Farage and Rees-Mogg and so forth. These people are a danger to the future of all of us. This is an existential threat, to use the technical term. It's a threat to our very existence. It's going to require us to radically change the way our civilization operates. And if we don't, our civilization will be terminated with extreme prejudice by an enraged nature, if you will.
But I've heard people connected to the oil industry tell me that basically we don't know it's man-made. It's always cyclical, the way that the climate moves. And, it's always changed. What about people that will tell you that, during the medieval period, there were lime trees in Nottingham and blah, 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 blah. What's the response to that?
So on the point about the oil companies, something quite important to understand. There's a very good BBC program that explains this. The first episode of which was made by a brilliant friend of mine. It's called Big Oil versus the World is the series. And I think you can still find it online. And what this series documents is that although it's quite true, as you said there, Neil, that during the period from about the 1970s to the early 2000s, the oil companies were engaging in mass disinformation and were actively supporting climate denialist groups. They don't do that so much anymore, but they did it at scale then, and they still find more subtle ways, some of them, of doing it now. That's true. But what not so many people know and what this TV series shows is that up until that point, Big Oil commissioned a lot of science to look into the greenhouse effect, and they were actually some of the leading theorists and analysts of the effect. And so Exxon, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, had scientists very accurately projecting the level of global temperature increase, which would unfold over the next 40, 50, 60 years. And so at that point, big oil was kind of thinking, well, this is a bit concerning. We better do something about this. But then tragically, at some point, they decided that what they'd do about it is start lying systematically about it to try and protect their profits in just the same way, of course, that tobacco had done previously. And that, by the way, is not a coincidence. Many of the marketing agencies and advertisers who for years and years tried to prolong the business model of cigarettes and to try to pretend that there was an open debate and nobody knew that smoking caused lung cancer, many of those advertisers and marketers were the very same people who then did the same kind of job for big oil.
Wow, that's incredible, actually.
Yeah, you can find out all about this. It's all totally documented. There's a really good book, for example, called Merchants of Doubt, which is named after a really sort of, horrible advertising executive type person who said, doubt is our product, right? If we can manufacture doubt, then we can get people to carry on buying the sub-products, if you will, of cigarettes, oil, etc. for longer.
That's incredible. There you go, conspiracy crowd. There's an actual real conspiracy.
There's a real conspiracy. Yeah, those are real puppet masters. And everybody because of course there are still people out there spouting climate change, disinformation and denial. And basically you're dancing to the tune of people who've become very rich by lying, and they're very grateful to you for your unpaid service to them. Tragically, your children and grandchildren won't be so grateful. And in fact, you won't be very grateful too, probably in a few years.
But some bloke on the street came up to me and said, this is all made up, surely, because they had to change the name from global warming to climate change.
Well, that's a fascinating story. That, again, is the inverse of the truth in the following sense. There was some research going on. This happened in America. It was also a matter of interest to the Saudis as to what way of describing this phenomenon was least worrying to people, was least likely to get them thinking, this is a cause for concern. That's the reason why people moved from talking about global warming to talking about climate change. Because when you ask people in a focus group, what do you think of climate change? And remember, this is like 30 odd years ago, 40 years ago. They would say, well, that sounds all right. Maybe we need a bit of a climate change. It'd be nice to have things a little bit warm around here. Whereas some people found the term global warming a little bit worrying. That, the whole globe is warming up. Maybe that shouldn't be happening. But of course, even the term global warming is actually a gross kind of understatement. That's why in my book, Why Climate Breakdown Matters, for example, I call it climate breakdown, right? These are the kind of terms we need to be using, truthful terms. And all of this history is, again, open to view for anyone who wants to follow it up. There's a very interesting analysis, for example, by the writer Stephen Poole in his book Unspeak. And he describes both climate change and global warming as unspeak, because what he means by unspeak is it's a way of talking that deludes you about the truth and distracts you from the truth. If we're going to talk truthfully, we need to use terms like climate breakdown, global overheating, terms that accurately describe the level of hazard that unfortunately we've now exposed ourselves to.
My understanding was that global warming was almost like a symptom of climate change. Climate change is the sort of broader thing. And the fact that the heating or the heating up, it's not that it's never been hotter than this. It's that the angle of trajectory, the sort of, the uptick is heating up faster than it has in the past. Is that correct?
That's pretty much right. Yeah. So there's at least two things going on. One is that, as you correctly say, it's too simple to say that what's happening is global overheating, because that is happening, but it also sometimes causes cooling in some places. For example, in the North Atlantic right now, there are parts of the North Atlantic which are rapidly cooling. Why? Because huge amounts of ice is being melted in the Arctic and is pouring into the North Arctic. Now, it's possible, I'm afraid, to have to tell listeners, in case you haven't spotted this, it's possible that this means that, with horrible irony, our climate over the course of this century in this country will be thrown into much colder conditions at the same time as most of the rest of the world is overheating. Because, of course, we're dependent in the UK on the Gulf Stream and a broader kind of ocean current system that keeps us much warmer than most parts of the world that are at this latitude are. So, yeah, it's too simple to call it global overheating. But at the same time, as you also say, global overheating is the broad underlying driver and phenomenon. And tragically, the temperatures are leaping up at the moment. Over the last year, they've been shooting up. If you look at graphs of ocean temperatures and surface temperatures over the last year, it is really, really, really worrying. Scientists don't quite know what is happening. They suspect it's partly to do with, ironically, with there being less air pollution now in the last few years, which is letting more of the sun's rays through and adding to the heating effect on the planet.
Albedo effect.
Yeah, that's right. We're it's a kind of albedo type situation. Albedo refers to how much of the incoming radiation gets reflected off. So yes, unfortunately, the fact that we're cleaning up our atmosphere, which is obviously essential to stop millions of people dying every year from air pollution, may be causing temperatures to leap up more quickly at the moment than they have been for some time.
John's asked a question. How does one combat the anti-climate argument that carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, so it's insignificant?
Yeah. Well, the answer to that is very simple, and I've already given it basically. Yeah, carbon dioxide is a very small amount of the atmosphere, but it's an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. Now, one can also illustrate the point by talking about other greenhouse gases, which are far smaller percentage of the atmosphere, but are even more powerful. So methane is a minuscule part of the atmosphere, but it is, well, it's hard to say precisely how much stronger it is than carbon dioxide because for complicated technical reasons, but it's roughly about 80 times as strong a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So if you have, if you release, say, 10 times as much methane as you're currently doing while cutting carbon dioxide emissions by 10 times, well, in the short run, you're going to make the situation even worse, even though, as I say, methane is a far smaller percentage again of the atmosphere. So really, these percentages don't mean very much by themselves. You have to look at how strong these are as warming gases. So, I mean, you might think of it as something like this kind of way. The layer of glass around a greenhouse is quite thin, but it makes a huge difference to the temperature inside the greenhouse. And even if you have even if you don't have glass, if you just have like a really thin layer of plastic, like in some polytunnels, that can still make the temperature inside way hotter than outside. So I hope that may help anyone who's still perturbed by how the greenhouse effect works.
What they're saying, oh, it's a tiny amount. It's like, well, yeah, but that's how significant those tiny thresholds are. It's like basically saying something like, oh, it was only a tiny amount of fentanyl. It's like, yeah, it doesn't take a huge amount, but there to be a huge response, basically. So weirdly, it's only 0.04% is actually, that's how fragile it is. Any more than that, and will cause serious problems.
Yeah, and another way of looking at this is when you look at pictures of our planet, right? And you see that, the planet's quite a big place. And then around the outside of it, it has this incredible thin layer, which is the atmosphere. And the atmosphere makes all the difference in the world to what goes on the surface of the Earth and in the oceans, right? That's why the temperature on the surface of the Earth is a lot stronger, a lot higher than the temperature on the surface of the Moon, even though they're the exact same distance from the sun. So the atmosphere itself is kind of thin and fragile and easily disrupted. And my God, have we disrupted it.
But what about people that say that carbon is the gas of life? And, more carbon, more plants, happy days.
Yeah, well, so the situation is true. There is a nugget of truth there. There's a nugget of truth in that in the right conditions, if plants have a bit more carbon dioxide, they will grow a bit more strongly. The problem is that the conditions aren't right? So what's happening now in large parts of the world is that trees and other plants are growing less strongly because, for example, they're exposed to more heat stress. and they're exposed to more heat stress because of the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is there because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So unfortunately, it's not absolutely not as simple as that. Yeah, absolutely. Carbon is the basis of life, but too much carbon in the atmosphere is making the Earth less hospitable to most life. And we are moving into a situation where many plants are going to struggle. Plus, of course, the horrifying fact that many plants are being burnt. I mean, of course, that's a broader problem in the sense that that's partly also due to forest clearance, etc. We must remember the climate crisis itself is only one part of a much broader ecological crisis that is caused by the unsustainable industrialized hyper-civilization that we have. But also another key reason, of course, for these wild, out of control wildfires that we've seen increasingly in recent years is global overheating. And just in terms of thinking about this from the UK perspective again, by the way, we should not consider ourselves immune here. We are desperately unprepared in this country for wildfires because we're not used to them, right? Unlike people in California or Australia, we don't have any history of having wildfires. But I would make a reasonably confident prediction that, unfortunately, over the next 5 years or so, it is quite likely that we will have wildfires like we've never had them before in this country, and we better get ready for them, as well as, of course, trying to address the root causes of why they're likely to be increasing.
So, you used to be the spokesman for Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion, a slightly controversial organisation. Can you tell us a bit about them? What's their mission? What are their tactics?
So, Extinction Rebellion was formed in 2018, and as soon as I found out about it, I got involved because I thought, this is the kind of thing I've been looking for. This is an organisation which is willing to be absolutely truthful about how bad the situation is, because people have for so often, it's so ironic that climate change deniers say, "Oh, you're exaggerating the problem, you're alarmist, etc." The truth has so often tended to be the opposite. So many politicians, so many scientists, so many media commentators across the years have tended, if anything, to downplay the severity of the situation for various reasons, including that they didn't want to scare the population. But guess what? We need the population to be alert to what's happening. Otherwise, how are they going to know how to respond to it adequately? So you've had a situation where people have been insufficiently warned. So Extinction Rebellion came along and said, we have to warn people adequately. We have to raise the alarm. And that's what we sought to do. And part of the way we sought to do it is by forcing a national conversation in 2019 by engaging in mass nonviolent civil disobedience in the tradition of the suffragettes and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and so forth. And, well, it worked. It worked better than any movement or political activity that I've ever previously been involved in. The conversation was forced and opinion was changed. Consciousness was changed. Opinion polls are very clear about that. Also, you had things like myself and colleagues went to discuss and negotiate with Michael Gove et al. From the government, and the upshot of that was that Parliament declared a climate and environment emergency, and then you got the first ever net zero law coming in that summer, and so forth. So Extinction Rebellion in the early days worked. Extinction Rebellion carried on trying to do the same thing and grew for a while. My view in 2020 started to become that maybe Extinction Rebellion had achieved most of what it was capable of achieving, at least for the moment. And like quite a lot of other former rebels, I decided to move on and to try to create an organization that would be more amenable, acceptable, welcoming to ordinary people, to ordinary citizens, many of whom would never have joined an Extinction Rebellion event. And that's what a lot of us have done. And we're trying to coordinate a lot of that work through this organization that I created called the Climate Majority Project. If you're somebody who gets the point of Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, but does not want to engage in nonviolent direct action, does not want to disrupt the public in the way that Just Stop Oil still do, for example, Extinction Rebellion has stopped disrupting the public. If you're somebody who falls into that category, if you vibe with the cause but not the tactics, then the Climate Majority Project is for you. That we are here for the majority who get it, that we are in trouble, and who want to do something about it, are not quite sure what to do, and understand that it isn't enough just to carry on seeking to raise the alarm.
I did think it was rather hypocritical of the conspiracy crowd because they were very behind things like the Canadian trucker protests and things like that, where essentially there were sit-ins and, mass civil disobedience and disruption, and yet decided that apparently Extinction Rebellion, where they're doing very similar things, were the worst people on the planet. And it was just, that's very disappointing. So tell us a bit more about Climate Majority, please.
So what we try to do is to help network and support and name, if you will, something which is already happening. And this is the really encouraging thing, that mostly below the radar, all sorts of organizations have been springing up over the past several years, which have been trying to organize ordinary people in effective ways in the places where they live, in the places where they work, in the places where they pray, and so forth. So let me give you a few examples. That's usually the easiest way to get people to understand what this is all about and what we mean by the climate majority. So, for example, we incubated an organization called Community Climate Action, which mainly exists in Brexit voting areas, conservative areas, and it's people getting together, seeking to grow food together, running a pub together, creating biodiversity and nature together. And it's a splendid thing. We're hungry in this time, aren't we, for community? And to undertake community action in such a way that you're making the world a better place, is a very high calling, I think. Then you've got an organization like, Lawyers for Net Zero, now renamed General Counsel Sustainability Forum. And what they do is they bring together, corporate lawyers, for major firms who are trying to get climate action happening through their firms. And so you can see there's an enormous difference between ordinary rural folk engaging in community climate action and elite corporate lawyers engaging in climate action. But they're all engaging in climate action, right? They're all pushing in the same direction. They're all part of the same wave that is emerging that includes them and also an increasing number of parents and people in the insurance field and other people elsewhere in the law, and many teachers and psychologists that we're working with, and people trying to put pressure on and hold their MPs to account, especially their MPs who are climate change deniers. And all of these organizations and all of these groups are, if you will, under the banner, broadly speaking, of the Climate Majority Project, or at least of the climate majority. They are part of this majority of people who are trying to step into this space of power and actually do something that, if you put it all together, could actually add up to a change of direction. That's what we need. People quite often feel a little bit hopeless in relation to the immense scale of the climate challenge, and the challenge around nature, and the challenge about how we need to transform our society in response. But when you start to see the scale of this emerging response, when you start to see that people across all these very different walks of life, very, very different kinds of people with different capabilities and so forth, when you start to see how they're all kind of starting to move in the same direction, then it seems to me you get into a position where some more hope is possible. And that's one of the key things we're trying to do, is to enable people to understand that when we act together, in the places where we have potential or actual power and voice, then there is hope that gets generated by that. And it doesn't have to be that the future is as bad as it otherwise will be if we allow the climate change deniers to get away with their nonsense and we frog march ourselves into the dustbin of history.
I've just noticed it's coming up to the 45 minutes. Are you all right for a couple more questions?
Yes. I'm feeling quite energized by your questions, so I'm still on a bit of a roll.
Excellent. Thank you. What about people that would say, yeah, but what about China? What about India? Like, they're pumping out huge amounts of things. There's nothing I, as an individual, can do about that.
Well, first thing there is, that's not true. It's not true. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So what we've just been talking about is the kind of thing you can do about it. You can join one of these groups. If one doesn't exist in your life or where you live or where you work, then you can form one along with other people. If you're not sure how to do that, then, consider getting in touch with us. Go onto our website, climatemajorityproject.com, and take it from there. There is something that everyone can do. And when people start taking action together, then they start to feel and sense their own power. And that is the way forward. Now, in terms of the whataboutery question, So this is quite complicated. So the first thing to say is, yeah, it's absolutely true that China and India are pumping out a lot of carbon and so on into the atmosphere. That's a real problem. The next thing to say is, well, why are they pumping it out? And it turns out that the main reason, the single biggest reason, is they're producing products for us, right? We've in effect outsourced a lot of our carbon emissions to these countries. And that was, well, it's kind of a mistake really, but it's certainly wrong for us to blame them for producing the products that we then go on to buy and consume, as the phrase goes. The next thing to say is that while it's true that there's a lot of kind of really awful production of dangerous carbon emissions in China and India, it's also true to say that the per capita emissions of the people who actually live in those countries are less than ours. In the case of India, they're way less. So we really need to look to ourselves first, and we've got to exercise responsibility here. We also in this country have a huge historical responsibility, right? We started the trouble, right? We were the first ones to have an industrial revolution. And if you add up our industrial carbon emissions across the centuries, they're absolutely astronomical. Also, we're continuing to be part of the problem now. So look, for example, at carbon finance. Look at who is financing the fossil fuel extraction, which is still going on around the world. Britain is a small country, but I can tell you we punch way above our weight when it comes to carbon finance. 15% of all the financial flows that are connected with fossil fuels go through the City of London. 15% of all the global worldwide flows go through that one square mile. So Britain has a huge responsibility to clean that up. But also the good news is that Britain has to some extent led the way on some of this. I'm talking about things like the net zero law we mentioned before. I'm talking about things like the very existence of Extinction Rebellion, and now the emergence of phenomena such as the Climate Majority Project. Other countries, to some extent, look to us for leadership. We need to show that leadership. And until we show that leadership, we absolutely cannot lecture poorer countries such as India about what they ought to do. And when it comes to China, it's also worth noting that although China is becoming truly an industrial behemoth, and that's a real problem, they also at least do have an ambition to become what they call an ecological civilization. And they are miles ahead. They are streets ahead of us when it comes to renewable energy. So much of the world's solar power and wind power is made possible by Chinese industry, or simply is present in China. You know, China have done a much better job at putting up onshore wind farms. They've done a much better job at putting solar panels on their own buildings and landscapes and so forth. So it just isn't good enough for people to say, what about China? As I've sought to describe in the last couple of minutes, there are multiple reasons why we need to step up and take responsibility, and some ways in which we should actually be inspired by them as well as trying to lead ourselves.
Okay, I've got just a quick one. Because there's always like a lot of confusion and misinformation in the conspiracy world. Like in the hopes that some of the conspiracy theorists are listening to this, can you explain exactly what net zero really means?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brent, because this term net zero is being used as a sort of demonization word now without being explained, right? Dodgy media such as GB News, dodgy politicians say, oh, the net zero agenda, this is a terrible thing. You know, what the net zero agenda really means is we need to reduce our carbon emissions to zero. And until we do, the problem will keep on getting worse forever. And that's what it boils down to, right? We need to stop throwing this stuff up into the atmosphere, which is ruining our collective future and is going to make our children's life a misery unless we change course. And that means we have to get to zero emission. Now, the net means that it is, at least in theory, possible to carry on emitting some climate dangerous carbon and other greenhouse gases, excuse me, if one compensates for that. For example, if you plant a load of trees, then that can compensate for some carbon emissions. So it's possible that we might never quite get to eliminating the use of fossil fuels, so long as we drastically reduce that fossil fuel use, and so long as we compensate for the remaining fossil fuel use by doing things like planting trees or maybe sucking carbon out of the atmosphere directly, then that would take us to net zero. So that's the sense in which net zero is a good and necessary objective.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Right. In the conspiracy world, people are terrified of the green agenda, particularly through organizations like the World Economic Forum and the United Nations Agenda 2030. So, can you assuage their fears that the green agenda is not some sort of nefarious plot to bring in world communism and reduce us all to peasants? I mean, do you actually believe the hype coming from the World Economic Forum and stuff like that? When they say, oh, we really should actually be conscious of the environment and stuff like that, did they mean it, or is it just all flim-flam?
So I can speak quite directly to that because I was once invited to the World Economic Forum in 2020. And I saw it from the inside. And it was an interesting experience, but it was, I must tell you, to some extent, a dispiriting experience. A lot of the people there were just there to make business deals. There was an enormous amount of carbon emissions expended by the rich people who flew there or used limousines to drive around the place at Davos. Whereas, I went there by train and certainly didn't take a limousine around the place. Now, my point is that far from the World Economic Forum at Davos being some kind of ultra green conspiracy, I mean, if only it were, and honestly, if only it were, I would almost be pleased if there were such a conspiracy. But you know what? The dangerous, sad thing is that there isn't. The World Economic Forum are trying to do a sort of good job of greenwashing and tinkering with business as usual. They are not going to save us. They're not. If they were going to bring in some kind of green utopia, I might be all for them, but they are absolutely not. So it is a pretty ludicrous target for conspiracy theorism, to be honest, the World Economic Forum. They don't have as much power as people think. And even if they did, they wouldn't be bringing in kind of extreme green measures. On the contrary, they are primarily a plaything of the ultra rich and of capitalism.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous with it. We will hopefully get you back on again because there's so much more that we could talk about, but we're very, very conscious of the time. So just to sort of wind up, what can people do if they want to help, if they want to get involved? As you said earlier, it can seem sort of daunting, a bit sort of like, oh my God, what the hell am I fighting against? Whatever. What is just like simple things that the average person could do to help?
Yeah, good. So let's start with one or two of the things that people can do just in their sort of day-to-day life in interacting with other people. So one good thing to do is to talk about the climate and to talk about nature, to talk about your concerns, to talk about your feelings, to talk about the changes that you may have noticed. Worth talking with farmers, for example, or older people or people who know about nature or experts on birds, flowers, etc. There are real changes and declines that are going on, and we need to talk about them. Also, if you hear nonsense being talked about climate, please consider being brave enough to challenge it. If you hear someone spreading disinformation, or if someone tries to spread it to you or to someone you love or something like that, please be willing to speak back. I'm not saying that you should engage in a long debate with someone who is a dogmatic climate change denier. My view is that is usually a futile waste of time. But what you shouldn't do is allow disinformation or misinformation to pass completely unchallenged and to seem as though it's acceptable. Now, moving on from that, we actually need to take positive action, and we need to take it together, right? It's not enough to think, oh, maybe I should fly less, or maybe I should eat less meat or something. It's worth doing those things. I do those things myself. But they are small beer compared to the kind of changes we need to make. We need to make changes through the political system. We need to make changes where we work. We need to make changes in our communities. All our institutions need to make changes. Whatever institution you're a part of, there is some way in which that institution could do the right thing on climate. So I'll just give you one or two sort of random examples. There are an increasing number of climate choirs. So this is people who love singing. And what they do is they sing about climate and nature and what we need to change if we're going to have a decent future for our children. There are people who are working to bring climate consciousness into sport. Sport has a really big footprint. People look to big sports people for sort of celebrity leadership, sometimes moral leadership. the way sport is done needs to change. And if it doesn't change, we're in trouble. And if it does change, things will move in the right direction. And the same applies, virtually wherever you look. So even if you feel like you're a very small person with no power in your life, you are part of something, whether it be your local community or an affiliation with a sports team maybe, or whether it be through where you work, or whether it be through where you club together with other people to try and make a difference in whatever way. Difference can have and needs to have a climate and nature dimension. The science writer, the science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, has a helpful thing to say. He says, any picture of our future, any story of our future, which doesn't have dangerous climate change and our efforts to deal with it built into that picture or into that story, is science fiction. Right? The world is changed. It will carry on, unfortunately, changing now for a very long time to come. For example, sea level rise is going to carry on for a long, long time to come, even if we get our house in order. So this is the great challenge of our times. And I can tell you from personal experience, there's nothing more brilliant or powerful than finding your purpose and stepping up to be part of the response to that challenge. And that is why I'm so delighted to be doing this work with the Climate Majority Project. And that's why I love talking about it with folks like you.
The irony is that there's a certain crowd that wants to claim that the green agenda is designed to take stuff away from the little people. And the irony of that is that basically if we don't do something about it, there's going to be something taken away from absolutely everybody. That's going to be far worse than any silly conspiracy theory about communist agendas and making us eat insects and stuff. So, thank you so much for the time. Tell us, how can we get involved with Climate Majority?
So the Climate Majority Project, you can find us at climatemajorityproject.com. Do sign up for email updates. Look around the website, and one of the main things you'll see is stuff there about how you can decide how best to pitch in, how you can best get involved with an existing group, a group that we incubate, a group that we collaborate with, a group that you might set up yourselves, whatever it might be. This kind of thing is happening all the time. And the more people who do it, the more we step into a virtuous circle where things get better and better rather than getting worse and worse.